Structure of language also involves syntax, and this kind of comes down to something you may have done in your early education. We certainly did it when I was very young, 45 years ago in the early 80s. This idea of diagramming sentences, if you've ever done that. So your text has a couple of diagrams here. This was meant to drive into our noggins the idea of the proper structure of language and what counts as what. So we can diagram the arrangements of the words in a sentence, which we'll do here in a second. But even in that realm, there are legal and illegal sentences. For instance, I can say, up the street Isaac ran, which is perfectly legitimate. But I cannot say, up Emily Kimberly rang. So in England, when they call somebody, they say rang. I can't say that up Emily Kimberly rang, but I could say, of course, Kimberly rang up Emily, etc. But no matter how I arrange it, the first sentence involving Isaac is perfectly legal. So one of the things that we know is that only noun phrases and verb phrases can undergo movement in a sentence. So as I look at this, I want to blow this up a tick. Emily rang up Kimmy, or Kimmy rang up Emily, whichever it is. I may have butchered the sentence. That has to stand as is. Also, with Timothy stood up his job interviewer. That means he didn't make the interview. In that case, that much must stand. Because those are not phrases per se. They are, what's the word I'm looking for? Just plain nouns by themselves instead of phrases. On the other hand, with Isaac here, Isaac ran up the street. I can basically take that noun phrase and move it around if I want to. Because it's an entire phrase, it's legal to move it up the street to the first part of the sentence. Whereas in other cases, it's not legal, if you will. I know that word sounds legal, but that's a very fine point of English, that one sort of sentence would be quote unquote illegal, which it clearly doesn't look right. You can't really say that. Up Emily Kimberly rang. That's a little silly. But the other sentence, as awkward as it might be, is still acceptable in some way. And one rule of language that emerges from all this is that only noun phrases and verb phrases can undergo movement, whereas the individual nouns and verbs can't be moved. Now, there's some other really fine points that Chomsky proposes, and this is Noam Chomsky, who's, again, very advanced age right now, who's extremely, extremely famous for his punditry. He's sort of, I guess you could call it, a progressive who made a lot of noise about the Iraq War 21 years ago. He was very upset about that, and a lot of other things. He tends to be on the left side of things, but he's really become an established intellectual, I guess you could say, at an early age. My gosh, since about 1960. So he's been at the very, very top of the intellectual community for 64 years. But his first career, before that all started, was as a linguist, and he has really gotten molecular, if you will, with some of the fine points of English language, like rewrite rules and lexical insertion rules, etc. So now these fine points are memorizable, I guess you could say. I don't think I'll test you on them, but they're probably beneath our consciousness. We tend to know what's acceptable and what isn't, what rings true in English and what could ever be typed without really knowing the rules. And that's kind of a major point too, that you can really get molecular and catalog the rules, but on the other hand, they're instantly recognizable as being rules. So here's another graphic that speaks in terms of noun phrases and verb phrases, etc. So the student will carry the shiny laptop, which of course has an Apple logo on it. I'm kidding. It used to be the case that Apple had a dominant share here for the first few years I was at SFA, and then was it Axes or Access, or I can't think of it. It has really come to have more of a share, as have a couple of Asus, I think, is another brand. So those laptops are perfectly good too. But anywho, the student is the noun phrase, and the verb phrase will carry another noun phrase, the shiny laptop. Could that be rearranged? The shiny laptop, the student will carry. Yes, it could have been, because those are phrases. So part of diagramming sentences is getting down into this sort of thing, and that's one of the things that we used to learn the rudiments of language back in the 80s.